I'm glad to see some new thinking coming out of IMF in recent days, particularly on capital account liberalization, something the IMF was strongly promoting for many years. In fact, disciplining countries if they strayed away. And now I think the evidence is clear, and I'm glad to see IMF is reconsidering that position. I think it's very important. I would like to see them reconsider other things. Some of the things I talk about in this book, particularly, are fiscal policy and monetary policy. I feel like the very restrictive fiscal and monetary policy approach has, again, in a way, been like handcuffs on the ability of governments to adequately invest in the underlying infrastructure and the health and education of their people, which, again, domestic companies need. Domestic companies need healthy, skilled workforces. They need infrastructure, they need roads and water and electricity. I think there was this sort of mythology in the minds of neoliberals that if you just got the government entirely out of the picture and entirely out of the way, that this private sector would somehow spring forth out of nothing and thrive. It was an interesting idea, but one I think that was wrong and has had deadly consequences. So I think that when the message I have for HIV/AIDS activists and more broadly speaking, public health and public education activists, and really for anybody who's interested in successful economic development, I would say that we should stand back and take a broader look at what's gone wrong with this model, and take a look at what the rich countries did do successfully. The rich countries, again, they helped support their domestic industries, and over time, it's those domestic industries and the formal sector economies that really raise the tax revenues, that provide the public expenditure, that enable countries to make the long-term public investments. Again, public investment as a percent of GDP. It's essential for long-term economic development. And I think that the neoliberal approach in the last few decades has really sort of cut off countries at the knees, sort of tying their hands and preventing them from moving forward with that approach. And so what I would say to the AIDS activists in particular is that if you want countries to have enough health personnel on the ground, out in the countryside, to roll out ARV programs, they're going to have a different developmental approach. Because it's not just a matter of getting a little more foreign aid for your country this year or next year. It's not just a matter of increasing the recurrent health budget. It's not just a matter of increasing the recurrent health budget a little or topping up wages a little. It's about scaling up public investment as a percent of GDP and the underlying health infrastructure. And there's no way that will happen as long as the tax base stays so small. And the tax base is going to stay small as long as interest rates stay so high. Whenever I go to developing countries, I always make a point to go visit the domestic companies, the domestic business associations. And a couple of the things they always complain about, I always say, what are your biggest constraints to expanding production and employment? They don't go through the list of the doing business report and give me those things. They say two things loud and clear every time, every country I go to. They say they're getting hammered by too much trade liberalization. There's too many cheaper goods coming in from the outside. Now, I'm not opposed to trade liberalization that's paced appropriately. The time and pacing is appropriate. I'm not opposed to letting some goods come in, but when you let in so many goods come in at one time that poor people in the country only buy those things and they don't buy the domestic goods, that your domestic companies go out of business, then that's a problem. That's not a development strategy. Okay, free trade for the sake of free trade as some ideological precept won't get you far in terms of economic development. But more importantly, the second thing they always complain about to me every time, every country I go to, is the high interest rates, the high cost on commercial credit. And why is the interest rate so high? Because the macroeconomic framework of the IMF insists that inflation be so low, and that's the main way they do it, is to raise interest rates. And the last thing I'll just say, because I'm running out of time, but the last thing I'll say is that in the rich countries, we've always understood very carefully that there's this trade-off. The economists call it the sacrifice ratio. We know, like if the Fed, if the central bank in the US or in the European Union, if we want to raise interest rates even a little 1/4%, we know it's going to cost jobs. We know. It's going to mean some businesses won't be able to afford the commercial credit, and it's going to cost jobs. It'll either be layoffs or jobs that would have been created won't be created. We know. It's right on the front page of the FT or the Wall Street Journal every time we talk about raising interest rates, even a tiny smidgen. We are very in tune with that trade-off. But when you ask the IMF, how do you guys calculate the sacrifice ratio? You want to lower inflation from 14% down to 7%, in 3 years, or if you want to keep it at 5% or 7%, how do you do it? Jack up interest rates to 18%, 20%. I'm like, okay, great. How many jobs will that cost? How much will that prevent your domestic companies from getting access to affordable credit? And it's like, again, blank faces, because they don't look. It's just not part of the calculus. It's not part of the trade-off. I ask, how do you weigh the sacrifice ratio? Because we do it in the rich countries. We do it. We're highly sensitive to it. We would never put up with 20% unemployment in the rich countries, 50% underemployment. We wouldn't put up with it for a minute. But in the IMF macro framework, they've been putting up with it. Again, I talk about that because I want you to see that connection between the ability of the domestic companies to thrive and expand and raise tax revenue. Tax revenue not just for recurrent expenditure, but for long-term public investment. Because that's really what's been missing from the picture for 30 years. And so what I say to the AIDS activists is that if you want countries to be able to fight HIV/AIDS more effectively, or to achieve other public health goals, or to achieve any economic development goals over time, you've got to really rethink this overall development model. So as much as I go into the details of fiscal and monetary policy in the book, and what the peer-reviewed literature shows and the evidence, I'm really much more concerned about standing back and asking what's up with this model, where has this model gone wrong, and really encourage people to have a bigger, broader rethink of this neoliberal development approach. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.